it's almost impossible, really, to summarize everything that has gone on this morning. And I think different speakers have really done the job in the different areas. I want to sort of go backwards, because one of the things that actually is at the center of everything that we're talking about is education. I think we've defined the diaspora now, and I think everybody knows that the diaspora is those of us of African ancestry who live in the United States, live in the Caribbean, live in Africa, or live in Europe. That's the diaspora that we're talking about. We're a worldwide diaspora. It's not just first generation who have come to live here in the United States. The problem with us as a people, therefore, in terms of our migrations which have been forced or otherwise, is that we don't necessarily know each other. And that is the basis of many of the problems that we have, and our inability to come together to do what needs to be done to advance the African continent and African civilization. And I say African civilization because it is a civilization. It's the oldest civilization. And we have to understand, too, when you look at China, the Chinese are a civilization, and one has to understand them as a civilization. So we have lost our understanding of ourselves as a civilization, and we need to be re-educated so that we do not need to copy the United States or Europe or anybody else. We have our own genesis, and our ideal has to be self-development and self-sufficiency along a timeline that's consistent with our history and our culture. To that topic, I just came back from Jamaica, where there was a Caribbean investment conference about bringing African Americans together with Caribbean Americans. It was in Jamaica, but it represented the Caribbean and it represented African Americans here. Andy Young was there, former Ambassador Andy Young, who has been very active Pan-African, both in terms of the Caribbean and in terms of Africa. And that's the type of concept that I think we need to emphasize. But one of the things that struck me at that conference was Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And he had just come back from Nigeria, brokering a relationship with the University of Lagos. He already had one with the University of Johannesburg, and he was reaching out because the principal of the City College, president of the City College of New York was there, Boudreaux, and he was organizing a relationship between City College and the University of the West Indies. And that is what we need in terms of exchange of students, so that students from here, African Americans, can understand people in the Caribbean on the ground, similar Africans here. The YALI program obviously is a big step in that direction, and it needs to be made something that's consistent and able to grow. But that is the key. And if you go back, from that through all the different things, education, healthcare, Africa does not have to go through the same healthcare pattern that Europe has gone through and we see here in America. Because as has been mentioned, we really have a disease treatment system here in the United States of America, not a healthcare system and not a system that prevents disease, because our socioeconomic status creates disease. And, we won't have time possibly to debate the whole agro-industry, but I'm one for, organic farming. I'm one for, small and medium-sized farming. I'm against GMOs. I'm against pesticides, fertilizers, and fungicides, et cetera, because it poisons the groundwater. Large amounts of tilling destroys the soil and the biomass and releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And we need to look at these things, you might say, from both an African perspective and a wider perspective in terms of climate change, because that's where we're going. One of the things I brought back from Jamaica was Sir Hilary Beckles is from Barbados. Barbados is a small island and it's flat. And he says at the rate that we're going in terms of the global warming and the degree of warming in terms of 2 degrees centigrade or whatever, Barbados will be underwater. in several years. So it's a matter of life and death. It's not, oh, gee, it rained a lot, or maybe we did have some fires in California, or maybe the Gulf states, the hurricane came up the Gulf state. It's life and death. So we need to be very, very cognizant of climate change when we're adopting an economic system, a farming system, et cetera, et cetera. So we do need these think tanks that were mentioned, I think, more than once, so that we can inform governments in Africa and inform ourselves and inform the Congress people. I was very, very, happy to hear the Congresswoman this morning asking for us to participate and give her information in terms of policy making and so on relative to Africa. I wanted to add in, of course, the Caribbean. But then that's my particular brief. I'm a Pan-Africanist, and that includes the Caribbean. Yeah. Buddy Mel over here give me a hard time. He always does. He's probably going to tell me to shut up soon, too. But it's a little hard to shut up for Garvey. I'm going. But interestingly, it's important for us to think outside the box, because that's what has to happen. We need a new paradigm, okay? And again, we can't knock the Chinese, because the Chinese are coming in. They have money, and they have engineering skills, and they're building infrastructure. The problem is our leaders are not making the right deals. And that's one of the problems. On the other hand, if you look at what has happened with Europe, with Belgium, with France, with England, and with some of our multinational companies, corruption is not a one-sided entity. Corruption has to take place with two people, as a minimum. And there was talk about I forget the name of the program, but looking at the way in which corporations function, and to make sure that they're paying their taxes, they're doing the right due diligence, and they're not causing harm environmentally and otherwise, and not corrupting. Now, if you look at the Congo, it's a terrible situation there. And there are American companies and American corporations that are going in there, fomenting civil war and flying out the diamonds with impunity. We know that. And it's not just America. I'm not bashing America per se, because I'm part of America. But I'm saying that our policies now need to take into consideration that Africa has other possibilities besides just America. And we have to go in there with something that recognizes, our own history in terms of our African American population, because that has been disadvantaged here. But it is an advantage for America to put the African American population in the forefront when it is dealing with Africa. And that's one of our briefs, Mel, that I think we need to take to Congress and to take to, well, it's not going to be OPIC anymore. I think it's going to be the Development and Finance Corporation with the 60 billion and so on and so forth. We have to be able to shape that policy in terms of how it's utilized on the continent. And then we have to bring our small and medium-sized business. We may not have the big businesses, but the small and medium-sized businesses here need to deal with the small and medium-sized businesses in Africa, or be part of the big conglomerates that are going to be doing businesses, if it's big infrastructure business in Africa. And there are a lot of infrastructure projects and so on and so forth. But I just want to say terminally here that there's an enormous space for us to pull all of this together to really make an impact, because we have the finances. Everybody knows about the remittances. There are more remittance money going back to Africa than foreign direct investment. That needs to be harnessed, and I'm sorry that Eric Guichard isn't here, because certainly he has a platform that does that, and he was part of that group that you made a presentation about. But that has to be harnessed. The money that is sent back to Africa into particular projects that are needed in the different countries. And apart from that, there's a lot of money here in the United States among African Americans, and also utilizing the different programs, whether it's the healthcare programs like PEPFAR, malaria, and so on and so forth, influencing the amount of money that goes into those programs, so that they can be spread all across Africa. I went to school in Canada, and I was just speaking with some Canadians down there in Jamaica who are investing significantly in Jamaica, particularly in the cannabis space. But anyway, that's sort of by the by. It's very important for us to organize ourselves at this particular point in time, because just as one can take a message from the current election, if you don't want to call it a blue wave, certainly it's internationalism as opposed to isolationism. It's not only internationalism, but we see that the global space is changing. China is now a dominant power, despite the fact that our president may not want to deal with China diplomatically. It will have to deal with China diplomatically at some point in time. So we have to take advantage of that global space and do what it is that we want to do and what we want to see happening in the next decade and for our children, our grandchildren, and so on and so forth. I just want to thank, Melfoot and the Institute for African Studies here at GW for this fantastic conference, and for me to have an opportunity to say something, and hopefully I'll be able to participate along with Mel and others to develop the concepts that need to be put together in this space so that we can all progress as African people, whether we're on the continent or here. As my father would say, Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. Thank you.
Question.